The plate sat on the warming tray under a square of foil, a wedge of cornbread balanced on top, a rubber band snapped around the whole thing the way Loretta Pinkney had wrapped it every morning for 3 years. It cost her about $1.10 to make, and she sold it to nobody. She carried it out to a man on a bench outside Ridley Drug, a man so quiet the whole block had learned to look right through him. She did not know that the bench, the pharmacy behind it, and the strip of sidewalk she set her table on every single day all belonged to him. And he did not know that the morning he finally spoke to her would cost him the one thing he had spent 50 years telling himself was the only thing in this world that stayed. But we need to go back. Loretta Pinkney was 61 years old, and she had been cooking for other people's mouths since she was 9. Her stand was not much. A folding table, 6 feet of dented aluminum she'd bought at a church rummage sale in 2003 for $4. A county vendor permit, number 882241, taped inside a sandwich bag against the weather. 2 warming trays that ran off a deep cycle marine battery her late husband Curtis had wired up himself back in 2009, 42 amp hours, enough to hold 3 trays at 160 degrees for 9 hours if she didn't open the lids too much. And a hand-painted sign that read Pinkness. Plate $6.50. The price the same as it had been for 4 years, because the last time she'd thought about raising it to $7, she'd pictured the face of a man counting quarters out of a coin purse, and she'd left it at $6.50 and gone on losing the 50 cents. She set up at 7:15 every morning at the corner of North Carey and the alley that ran behind Ridley Drug, in the part of West Baltimore where the row houses stood shoulder to shoulder like people waiting for a bus that wasn't coming. Some of them lived in, some of them boarded with plywood gone soft and gray at the edges, the city's orange violation stickers peeling off in the sun. 1100 block, she knew every door of it. She woke at 4:45, not because an alarm told her to. Her body had kept that time for 31 years, the way a body keeps the shape of a thing it has done 10,000 mornings. She lay still for a minute in the dark, listening to the house settle and tick, and then she got up and put her feet in the slippers Curtis had bought her the last Christmas he was alive. December of 2017, $12.99 at the drugstore, the left one worn through at the heel now so the sole touched the cold floor when she walked. The kitchen was the warmest room because it was the smallest. She turned on the front left burner first, always the front left because the back 2 ran weak ever since the regulator went, and she set the skillet down on it to come up to heat while she got the rest going. She cooked the way she had been taught. Her mother, Vernita, had come up from Allendale County, South Carolina in the back of a Trailways bus in 1959, 3 days on the road for a fare of $11.40, with 2 changes of clothes and a cast iron skillet wrapped in a flour sacks so it wouldn't bang the seat. That same skillet sat on Loretta's stove 66 years later, black and slick, and heavier than a brick 12 inches across with a poor spout worn smooth on the left side from 1,000 hands tipping grease. Loretta could not have told you what it weighed. She could have told you that you never washed it with soap, that you wiped it out and put it back on a low flame to dry, and that it had fed 4 generations and would feed a 5th if the Lord was willing, and the gas company stayed paid. $74 a month, due the 12th. She made smothered chicken on Mondays, 8 thighs to a tray, $1.29 a pound when it was on sale at the Save-A-Lot, more when it wasn't. Oxtails on Thursdays when she could get them, because oxtails had gone from $3.99 a pound the year Curtis died to $9.40 now. And she had to be careful, had to buy 3 pounds and stretch it with extra gravy and nobody the wiser. Collard greens every day, 2 big bunches at $1.79 each, cooked down slow for 2 hours and 40 minutes with a smoked turkey neck instead of pork, because half her regulars had the blood pressure, and she was not about to put a single one of them in the ground over a plate of greens. Cornbread in the skillet, never from a box. 1 cup of cornmeal, 1 egg, a half cup of buttermilk, a tablespoon of bacon grease in the skillet so hot it smoked, the same handful and the same crack her mother had used. 22 minutes at 4:25. A square of it set on top of every plate she made. And here is the thing about Loretta Pinkney that nobody on that corner thought to wonder about, because people rarely wonder about the ones who feed them. She cooked too much. Every morning without deciding to, she made 1 plate more than she would sell. She had done it so long she didn't see it anymore. But it was there in the rhythm of her hands, in the way she'd reach for 1 more chicken thigh, 1 more scoop of greens, 1 more square of bread, automatic as her own pulse. She had cooked for 4 her whole married life. Curtis, herself, their son Andre, and her mother in the back room until the day Vernita passed. 4 plates, 4 chairs, the little kitchen table with the burn mark from where Andre had set a hot pot down when he was 11 and too proud to use a trivet. Then Vernita went in March of 2014, 87 years old in her sleep, which was the only easy thing that woman ever got. Then Andre grew up and moved to Atlanta in 2016 for a job at a logistic warehouse, 1940s an hour to start. And he called on Sundays for a while, then every other Sunday, and now sometimes the phone went 3 weeks. Then Curtis sat down at that same table on a Tuesday morning, the 20th of March, 2018, with a cup of coffee he never finished. She'd kept the cup. It was still in the cabinet, third shelf, and his heart, which had carried 58 years and 3 jobs and one stubborn good man, simply stopped at 6:47 in the morning. And Loretta kept cooking for 4. She did not do it on purpose. That was the part she could never explain. On the rare nights she tried to explain it to herself with the TV off. She just could not unlearn the hands. So the extra plate got made, and the extra plate had to go somewhere. And for a while, she gave it to Miss Pearl 2 doors down at 1109, and then Miss Pearl's hip went and her daughter put her up in the home on Liberty Heights, and the plate needed a place again. Mama Vernita used to say a thing, in that low South Carolina voice that came up out of her like water out of deep ground. She used to say, "You set one more plate than you got mouths, baby." Because hungry don't always knock. Sometimes it just sits down quiet and waits to see if you'll notice. Loretta had heard that her whole childhood and figured it was just a thing old women said while they stirred a pot. She did not understand it was an instruction until she was past 60 and standing on a corner with a plate in her hands and nowhere to put it. She did not tell anyone she gave food away. There was nothing to tell. You don't announce that you breathe. She walked the 7 blocks to her corner because the bus fare had gone to $2 each way, and that was $4 she could keep in the coffee can on top of the refrigerator, the can that said Maxwell House in red letters worn pink at the corners. The can held exactly what she could spare toward the property tax that came due every July. 1,847s on a 2-story row house Curtis had finished paying off in 2017, the year before he died. $312 a month for 19 years and then nothing, then free and clear, then his coffee going cold. She was $41 short this July. She knew the number the way she knew all her numbers, exactly, with no rounding, because a woman who rounds is a woman who ends up short, and a woman who ends up short ends up explaining herself to a man behind a window, and Vernita had taught her there are men you do not give the satisfaction. She wore a satin bonnet under a head scarf in the mornings until her hair was set, and over her apron she wore a man's flannel shirt of Curtis's, blue and gray check, soft at the elbows, because the collar of it still held, very faintly, the smell of him. She could not have told you what he smelled like anymore. Old Spice and motor oil and something underneath that was only ever him, only that the absence of it would have been worse than the fading. Her shoes were white nursing shoes from the medical supply on Pennsylvania Avenue. $34.99, resoled twice at the cobbler's for $18 a time. She never complained about her feet. She had worked out over 30 years a way of standing for 9 hours that her body did on its own. Weight back on the heels, knees soft, the way you stand when standing is the job. This was Loretta Pinkney before the morning the man on the bench spoke. A woman the city looked through. A woman who fed a neighborhood off a folding table and kept exactly $41 between herself and the taxman. A woman who cooked for 4 at a table set for 1 and gave the 4th plate to whoever hungry happened to sit down quiet and wait. There was a girl, the spring before all this, a young thing maybe 19, who came to the table at the end of the day with 2 crumpled singles and her chin up and asked what she could get for $2. Loretta made her a full plate, chicken and greens and 2 squares of bread, and waved off the $2 and told her it was the end of the day and it was going in the trash otherwise, which was a lie, and the girl knew it was a lie, and took the plate anyway because the lie was a gift wrapped around a gift. Loretta never saw her again. She thought about her sometimes. She thought about a lot of people she fed once and never saw again. She kept no count of them. Counting, Vernita had said, was for the taxman, not for the table. The man on the bench had been coming for years before Loretta started feeding him. Ezra Holloway was 81 years old, and he had more money than anyone on that block could have imagined if you had given them all night and a calculator that went high enough. He had come up from the south too, though further down and longer ago. Allendale was Loretta's mother's county. Ezra was from one over, Bamberg County, a wide flat place of tobacco and dirt roads where his father had worked another man's 140 acres for a third of the crop and died at 44 with nothing but a mule's lead rope coiled on a nail and a name that meant nothing past the county line. Ezra rode north in the fall of 1961, 17 years old, fare paid by a cousin, with the cousin's address folded into the lining of his left shoe and a single Zadia burning in him so hard it never once, in 64 years, he was never going to work land that wasn't his. He swept floors at a tobacco warehouse down on the harbor for $1.15 an hour. He learned to lay brick from a Polish mason named Stanley Kowalski. And yes, Ezra had heard the joke about the name 1,000 times, and Stanley had heard it 10,000. who cussed him in 2 languages and taught him every honest thing he knew about a plumb line and a level course, and how a wall that's true will stand 100 years and a wall that's a quarter-inch out will crack in 5. Ezra put away $7 out of every 10 he made. He lived in a rented room on Druid Hill with a hot plate and a shared bath for 19 years, and in the spring of 1968, when the avenue burned and the white men who had held the deeds went and sold out at 30 cents on the dollar and ran for the county, Ezra Holloway did the thing that nobody else with $1 in his pocket would do. He bought the row of 3 storefronts on the 1100 block of North Cary that every soul in the city said would never come back. He bought them for $6,200 cash and a handshake, and a belief he could not have argued for but never doubted, that a neighborhood is not a thing that ends, it is a thing that waits. He fixed the roof himself with tar and a torch and 2 days of his own sweat per building. He laid the brick himself, plumb and true the way Stanley taught him. He rented the corner to a young pharmacist named Walter Ridley, who couldn't get a bank in the state of Maryland to loan him bus fare on account of his color, and Ezra carried the man's first 18 months himself. No rent, because a corner needs a druggist more than a landlord needs 18 months. Over the next 50 years he bought more. Quietly. 41 parcels in the end across 4 square blocks, every one of them through a company, because a black man buying property in that city in those decades learned fast that quiet was a kind of armor, that a name on a deed was a target if it was the wrong name. He named the company when his lawyer made him name it in 1974, the only thing that came to mind, HD Holdings, LLC. He told the lawyer it didn't stand for anything. It stood for Della. Della Mae Holloway had married Ezra in 1969 in the basement of Sharon Baptist Church with $30 of carnations and a borrowed dress 2 sizes too long that her aunt pinned up the morning of. For 46 years she had been the warm half of him, the half that remembered names, that knew which tenant's mother was in the hospital and which one had just buried a brother, that made him knock the rent down for the widow on the 2nd floor of the Cary Street building and never put it back. Della was the reason HD Holdings forgave more rent than it ever collected on. Ezra would scowl over the green ledger books at the kitchen table on the 1st of every month, and Della would say, "Ezra Holloway, you cannot eat a building," and he would say, "You can if you sell it," and she would laugh at him low in her throat until he laughed too, and then forgive another month's rent before she got up to do the dishes. Della died in the spring of 2021, pancreatic. 11 weeks from the word in the doctor's office to the grave at Mount Auburn, plot 14, row C, beside the space she'd made him buy for himself the same day so they'd lie side by side. $3,400 for the pair in 2009 when she made him do it, an argument he lost the way he lost all the ones that mattered. After that, Ezra Holloway stopped going inside his own house. It was a good house, a real house, brick with a yard, up off Garrison Boulevard, paid off in 1985. He could not stand the quiet of it. He could not stand the way her reading glasses still sat folded on the arm of the green chair, the way the second sink in the upstairs bath still had toothpaste flecks dried on the mirror that he would not wipe off, because wiping them off was a thing you could only do once, and once it was done, she was that much more gone. So he did what a man does when grief turns the inside of his own life into a country he cannot live in. He went outside. He started taking the number 13 bus down to North Cary, to the oldest piece of everything he owned, and sitting on the bench in front of Ridley Drug. He wore an old gray field coat that had been a good coat in 1991 and looked, now, like exactly what a man on a bench wears. He did not tell anyone who he was. Walter Ridley's son Marcus, who'd taken over the pharmacy in 2010, knew and kept the secret because Ezra had asked him to. To every other soul on that block, the old man on the bench was just an old man on a bench. They walked past him. They learned to look through him the way the city had learned to look through Loretta. 2 invisible people, sitting 20 feet apart, 6 days a week, neither one of them knowing the other was carrying anything heavier than a coat. Ezra had built an empire on a single hard belief, and after Della died that belief set up like concrete and became the only thing holding him upright. "Buildings stay," he told Marcus Ridley one evening in 2022, the 2 of them pulling the grate down over the pharmacy at dusk. "That's the whole of it, son. People go, buildings stay. You hold the deed, you got yourself something that can't pack up and leave you in the night." He said it flat, not bitter, the way a man states the temperature. It was the lesson his whole long climb had taught him, and the lesson Della's 11 weeks had carved into stone. Don't love what walks, love what you can put your name on, hold the deed, not the hand. He believed it. He believed it on that bench for 3 years. And it was wrong, dead wrong, top to bottom wrong, and it would take a 61-year-old woman with a foil plate and a rubber band to prove it wrong, and the proving would break him open, the way a wall comes down when the keystone goes, all at once, and from the inside. But he did not know that yet. He just sat there in his gray coat, looking through people, being looked through, holding the deeds to 4 square blocks of a city that had no idea, none whatsoever, that the old man on the bench owned the ground it walked on. The first plate happened by accident, the way the realest things do. It was a Thursday in October, 3 years before the morning that mattered, the kind of gray Baltimore day where the damp gets into the brick. Loretta had her oxtails going. She'd made the extra plate same as always. And Miss Pearl was already up at Liberty Heights by then, and the plate sat on the warming tray at 11:30 with nowhere to be. The old man on the bench was always there. Loretta had registered him over the months the way you register a fire hydrant, a fixed thing, part of the corner, furniture the city forgot to haul off. But that Thursday she happened to look over at the exact moment he was not looking at anything at all, and she saw in the slack of his face when he thought no one was watching, a particular thing she knew on sight because she had carried the identical thing herself for 3 years by then. She saw a man whose table was empty. She didn't think about it, she didn't decide. She picked up the extra plate, walked the 20 feet over and held it out. "You eat oxtails?" she said. The old man looked at the plate a long moment. Then he looked at her. There was a second where she thought he might be one of the proud ones. The ones too far gone into their own dignity to take a thing from a stranger's hand. And she had her line ready, she always had her line ready. She kept 3 of them. "It's gonna go in the trash otherwise, you'd be doing me the favor," but she didn't need the line. He took the plate. He said, "Thank you, ma'am," in a voice rusty from sitting unused all day, and that was the whole of it. She went back to her table. She did not watch him eat, because watching a man eat your food like you've done him, a kindness is its own quiet cruelty, and Vernita had taught her that too, with a slap on the wrist the one time at age 10 that she'd stared. She just went back to selling her 6.50 plates to the lunch crowd off the buses. The next day she made the extra plate and walked it over without a word. He took it without a word. Cornbread on top, rubber band around the foil because she'd started wrapping his to go. He had no place to sit but that bench, and the bench got cold by noon in winter, and a wrapped plate holds its heat 11 minutes longer than an open one. She'd timed it once on the stove without meaning to. And that was the whole arrangement for 3 years. She never learned his name and he never offered it. She learned he liked the cornbread by the way he ate it first, every single day, before he touched a thing else. She learned he didn't care for okra by the way he left it, polite, pushed to the far edge of the foil. And so after the 3rd time she simply stopped putting okra on his plate, the way you stop salting a dish for the one who watches their sodium. She knew by the end of the first winter that he had nobody, because a man who is somebody does not sit on a metal bed in 28-degree February. She did not ask. You do not ask hungry, it's business. You set the plate down and you go back to your pot. She gave that man a plate of food every working day for 3 years. Call it 300 days a year, call it 900 plates, near 1,000 squares of cornbread out of her mother's skillet, and it never once crossed her mind to wonder who he was. Because she had been raised by a woman who taught her that the wondering and the feeding are 2 entirely separate jobs, and only one of them was hers. He ate her smothered chicken on Mondays, her greens cooked with the turkey neck instead of pork, because she'd clocked the pill bottle outline in his coat pocket the first month, and cooked for his pressure without ever being told he had it. He ate her cornbread first. 300 days a year, 3 years running. A man who could have bought the building, bought the block, bought the whole avenue and the bus line that ran down it, and never felt the dollar leave his hand. He never told her, she never asked. And the not asking was the kindness, the whole architecture of the kindness, though neither one of them had the words for it then. The notice came on a Tuesday in June, and it came for all of them at once. It was taped to the glass door of Ridley Drug and to the door of Vernon's barber shop next door, and to the plywood face of the empty storefront, and a 4th copy of it sat under a chunk of broken brick on Loretta's folding table when she got there at 7:15. Cream-colored cardstock, heavier than it needed to be, a navy blue logo at the top she didn't recognize, the kind of typeface that costs money to look that plain. Calverton Urban Partners, it said. And under that, a great many words that all came down to one word, which is the word those letters always come down to. Go. Loretta read it twice, slow, the way you read a thing that's trying to slide past you. The corridor, T like the street where she'd stood for 22 years was a hallway, was entering a repositioning initiative. Existing month-to-month tenancies and informal vendor arrangements would not be continued past September 30. The phrase that did it, that sat down in her chest like a swallowed stone, was informal vendor arrangements. That was her. 22 years on that corner, and she was an informal vendor arrangement, with 98 days to clear off. She found out over the next week that she was the least of it. Ridley Drug was closing. Marcus Ridley, who had taken over from his daddy Walter in 2010, who had filled prescriptions on that corner for 53 years between the two of them, who let half the neighborhood run a tab in a marble composition book and rounded insulin down to whatever a person had on them and ate the difference, was being told his lease would not renew. There was a national chain that wanted the corner for what the notice called a flagship wellness format. T and Calverton Urban Partners had a fiduciary obligation to maximize asset performance. T and that, in 11 words of clean cold language, was the end of Marcus Ridley and the only pharmacy in 9 blocks that would still put a bottle of heart medicine in an old woman's hand 3 days before she could pay for it. Loretta sat with that. She sat with the picture of Miss Annie Caldwell, 86 years old, 2 streets over on Edmondson, who walked to Ridley's with an aluminum cane because Marcus knew her and her granddaughter's number and a chain store would know neither, where Miss Annie was going to get her pressure pills come October, and how far that cane could carry her. And the answer was nowhere. The answer was she couldn't. The answer was a fall on a January sidewalk and a hip, and the home on Liberty Heights like Miss Pearl, like all of them, one repositioning initiative at a time. So Loretta Pinkney did a thing she had never once done in 61 years. She decided to make a fuss. Not for herself. She kept her own loss tucked away small, the way she kept everything. A corner she could maybe find again, somewhere, somehow at 61, with a folding table and a 42-amp-hour battery. But Marcus and Miss Annie and Vernon the barber that Curtis used to go to every third Saturday, and the whole quiet web of an old neighborhood holding itself up with tabs and favors and rounded down prices that she could not look through. That she had to walk toward. She read the bottom of the notice. There was an address for tenant inquiries. A downtown high-rise on Pratt Street, the kind of building with a name and a fountain in the lobby and a man at a desk to ask your business. There was a name, J. Calverton, Managing Director. There was a date, July 18, 6 p.m., a community information session, which Loretta understood, having lived 61 years, to mean a room where they would announce the decision and call it a conversation and offer cookies. She stood at her table for 11 seconds, perfectly still, the notice in her hand and the morning's first 2 plates going cold on the tray behind her, deciding. Then she folded the notice into 4 and slid it into the breast pocket of Curtis's flannel shirt, against her heart, the way you keep a thing you mean to fight. The old man was on his bench. He had read his own copy. Marcus had walked it out and put it in his hands, watching his face the whole time, and Ezra Holloway had sat very still and said nothing, because Ezra Holloway, of every soul on that corner, was the one single person who could have made the whole thing vanish with one phone call, and he had not yet let himself understand that he was the one who had to. Calverton Urban Partners was not some outside wolf that had come sniffing up the avenue. Calverton was the firm Ezra had hired himself, 10 months back after Della died and the green ledger books got away from him, and his lawyer of 40 years sat him down and told him an old man drowning in grief had no business managing 41 parcels alone. Hand it to professionals, Ezra. Let them optimize the portfolio. You've earned not having to think about it. And Ezra had signed the management agreement without reading every one of its 19 pages, because he could not in those months make himself read anything, because the only thing he had left was the deeds, and the deeds did not need him to love them, did not need him to read them, did not need him at all. He had given Calverton exactly one instruction, 3 words, still smart, and to a firm whose whole religion was asset performance. What was smart was a wellness flagship at market rent and a fiduciary obligation, and 98 days for the informal vendor arrangement. Ezra owned every brick of it. Ezra had let it happen by looking away for 10 months. The fire coming up the corner was a fire he had paid a firm $11,000 a month to set, and he did not know it because he had stopped reading his own mail the exact way Loretta could not stop cooking for 4. Grief takes some people's hands and won't let them quit setting the extra plate. It takes other people's hands and makes them stop holding the deed they swore by. Same grief. Opposite hand. She walked his plate over that Tuesday like every other day. Smothered chicken, it being a Monday's leftover stretched into Tuesday. Cornbread on top, rubber band. She set it on the bench beside him because his hands were lying open and still in his lap and he didn't reach for it. They're putting us out, she said. She didn't know why she said it to him. She had never said more than, "You eat oxtails," to the man in 3 years. Maybe because his table was empty and so now was the corner about to be, and a person carrying something heavy will sometimes set a corner of it down on the nearest quiet bench. Whole corner, September. She looked down at him. "You got someplace to go?" Ezra Holloway looked at the plate. Then he looked up at her, at this woman who had just been handed her own eviction and whose very first question, before she asked one single thing for herself, was whether he had somewhere to land. "No, ma'am," he said, "I don't believe I do." "Then I'll find you one," Loretta said, and went back to her table and did not turn around, and so did not see the old man bend his head down toward the foil plate in his lap and stay that way, not eating, for a long, long time. They sat 3 feet apart on a metal bench for 3 years, and never once saw each other for what they were. He watched her every working day and never saw a woman with $41 standing between herself and the taxman. He saw a kindness, abstract, a thing that arrived at 11:30, the way weather arrives. She walked past him every working day and never saw 4 square blocks of deeds folded up inside a gray field coat. She saw an empty table, and her hands knew exactly what to do with an empty table. The week after the notice, the distance between the two of them got smaller in ways that neither one of them noticed at the time. Loretta started fighting, in the only way she knew, which was the way her mother had fought everything from Allendale County to a Baltimore row house, with her 2 feet and her cooking, and a flat refusal to be moved off a spot she had decided to hold. She made a flyer at the Enoch Pratt Branch Library on a computer she had to ask the teenager at the desk to help her run, and she printed 40 copies at 15 cents a page, $6 even, and she felt every dollar of it. Communication session, July 18, 6 p.m., Sharon Baptist. She taped one to her warming tray and handed the other 39 to every single person who bought a 6 to 50 plate, and she told each of them, looking them in the eye, that they needed to be in that room or quit complaining forever. She got Vernon the barber, who closed his shop 2 hours early, to come. She got Deacon Pruitt from Sharon Baptist, who got her the basement for free. She got Marcus Ridley, who said he'd be there and went home and could not sleep. She got Miss Annie Caldwell, who said she'd come if somebody could drive her, and Loretta said she'd drive her in Curtis's old Buick LeSabre that hadn't turned over in 14 months, and then had to spend $19 on a jump and a gallon of gas and a prayer to get the thing running, and did it without a second thought. Ezra watched all of it from the bench. He watched a 61-year-old woman organize the defense of his property against his own management company on behalf of his tenants. And somewhere in the dim back rooms of his grief, an old man began very slowly to wake up. He went home. For the first time in 3 years, Ezra Holloway took the number 13 up to the good brick house off Garrison and let himself in the back door and stood a minute in the kitchen with his coat still on. Then he sat down at the table where Della's chair still faced his across the formica, and he got the file box down off the closet shelf. It took him 2 tries, his shoulders and what it was, and he read the Calverton management agreement he had signed without reading. All 19 pages. His finger under every line, the way his father had taught him to read what little his father could read, sounding out the hard words the way he had at the warehouse at 17. And he found the wellness flagship in paragraph 4 Bibe, and he found the fiduciary obligation in paragraph 7, and he found in the clean machined language of paragraph 11 say, the September 30 that was going to put Marcus Ridley and Miss Annie Caldwell and the woman who fed him cornbread out on the street, in his name, with his money, by his own 3-word instruction. He sat in Della's kitchen until the light went out of the window over the sink and the room went dark, and he did not get up to turn on the bulb. He held a piece of paper instead of a hand, and for the first time in 50 years he understood, all the way down, what he had let his one hard belief turn him into. Stay. People go, he had said it like wisdom. He had said it on that bench like a man who'd figured out the trick of living, and it had made him into something he could not stand to look at. A man rich enough to fix anything, who had stopped reading his own mail so that strangers he'd never met could evict the last living, breathing, name-remembering thing on his oldest corner, which was people, taking care of people, for nothing, the exact way Della used to do it out of their own kitchen before the 11 weeks took her. He did not call Calverton that night. He should have. A better man, a braver man would have. But Ezra was 81 years old, and he was afraid in a way he could not have put a name to, of what would land on the face of the woman with the foil plate the moment she found out who had been letting his food go cold in his lap for 3 years. So he held the thing one more week. He let it come to the room. He let it come to the basement of the church where he'd married Della, though he had not let himself think yet about what that meant. On the night of July 16, 2 days before the session, Loretta closed up late. She'd stayed an hour past dark folding the table and going over what she'd say in that downtown room. Except it wasn't downtown, it was the church basement, but in her mind it was downtown. It was always downtown. It was always a room with men who said corridor and meant your whole life. She'd written her piece on the back of a Bonneville Power envelope, and she couldn't make it sound like anything but an old woman begging and begging. Vernita had taught her, gets you a plate and a closed door. The corner was empty. The streetlight at the alley had been out since May, the city ticket unanswered. The old man was still on his bench, which was strange, because he was always gone by dusk every day for 3 years. She went over to tell him to get on home before the damp got into his chest. She found him not eating. The plate sat beside him on the bench untouched, the foil dull, the cornbread square gone hard at the edges. And the old man, who had spoken maybe 40 words to her in 3 years, was sitting with his hands open on his knees, talking, not to her, to the dark across street the way the old ones do when the day is over and the company is only ghosts. 46 years, he said, and I told her she couldn't eat a building. He laughed, a dry sound with no floor under it. That's what she'd say to me. Ezra, you cannot eat a building first of every month. And I'd say back, you can if you sell it. He shook his head slow. Thought I was being smart. Lord knows I thought I was being smart. Loretta did not interrupt. She had a gift for not interrupting. It was the same muscle as not asking. She sat herself down on the cold far end of the bench, 3 feet of green-painted iron between them, and let the man talk into the dark. I had somebody, Ezra said. Best somebody a fool ever did get. 46 years, and she went on ahead of me, and I figured, well, all right then, that's that. You can't hold on to what walks off, so from here on I'll just hold on to what stays. He looked finally down at the plate beside him, the foil gone gray in the dark, the rubber band, the hard square of bread. 3 years I've been sitting on this bench telling myself a building's the better bet than a body on account of a building can't up and leave you in your sleep. And every single one of those days somebody come walking out of nowhere and put a hot plate in my lap and didn't want a thing back for it. Didn't ask my name. Didn't ask was I worth knowing. His voice went at the edge, like the first crack across ice on a step. I had it backwards, ma'am. My whole life I had it exactly backwards, and it took me 81 years and a plate of greens to see it. The deed don't keep you warm at night. The deed never one time in its life kept anybody warm. Loretta still did not know who he was. She thought she was sitting beside a poor old widower with a building somewhere far back in his story, the way every old person's got a building or a farm or a good year somewhere back there, talking grief the way grief talks when the street light's out. She reached over and put her hand over his open hand on his knee. The first time in 3 years she had ever touched the man, and his hand was cold, and she said the only true thing she had in her. My Curtis went in 2018, she said. 7 years past March, and I still cook for 4. She squeezed his cold hand once and let it go. Hungry don't always knock, my mama used to tell me. Sometimes it just sits down quiet on a bench and waits to see is anybody gonna notice. She stood up, knees soft, the way you stand when standing's been the job your whole life. You eat your bread now, you hear me? I made it special, there's honey in it tonight. She went home. She walked the 7 dark blocks and let herself in and hung Curtis's flannel on the hook and did not know, could not have begun to know, that she had just put into the open hands of an 81-year-old man the one thing that would finish bringing down a wall he had been hiding behind for half a century. She just knew his table had been empty, and that for a few minutes on a dark bench it had been, somehow, a little less so. Ezra Holloway sat alone on his own bench, in front of his own pharmacy, on the corner of his own block, and he ate the cornbread first, the way he always had, the way he had 1,000 times, and the tears came to the deep lines of his face and dropped onto the foil, slow at first and then not slow, and it was the first time he had wept since the 11th week of Della's dying. It did not sound the way grief sounds when somebody's there to hear it. It sounded like an old man finally setting down a thing he'd carried so long, so far up so many years, that he'd flat forgotten it was heavy, and the setting down hurt worse and better than the carrying ever had. The community information session was held in the fellowship basement of Sharon Baptist Church, because the church had the only room in 9 blocks big enough that would take them for free, and the deep irony of that the basement where Ezra had married Della in the summer of 1969 with $30 of carnations would be the room where his belief finally came down, was lost on every living soul present, because only one man in the room knew it, and that man had not yet stood up. Calverton Urban Partners sent a man named Jordan Calverton, 34 years old, son of the founder, a good charcoal suit, a careful voice, and a slideshow he ran off a laptop onto the cinderblock wall. He talked about revitalization. He talked about bringing premium services to an underserved corridor. He talked about exciting national partners and a projected 41% increase in foot traffic. And he had a particular way of saying every sentence so that it closed a door on you while sounding for all the world like he was holding it open and inviting you through. The room was full. 60-some folding chairs, every one of them filled, people standing along the back wall under the water pipes. Loretta had filled that room one $6.50 plate at a time. Vernon, the barber, Deacon Pruitt, Marcus Ridley in the second row with his arms crossed. Miss Annie Caldwell in the front row with her aluminum cane stood up between her knees and both hands resting on the curve of it. When Jordan Calverton said it was time for community input, there was a silence, the kind of silence a room full of people who've been told no their whole lives makes in front of a man with a slideshow. And then Loretta Pinkney stood up. Her Bonneville power envelope was folded in her hand and she did not once look down at it. My name is Loretta Pinkney, she said. The room knew her. The room got quiet for her the way it had not gotten quiet for the slideshow. I have sold plates on the corner of North Cary for 22 years. $6.50 a plate, and I will tell you the truth, in the house of the Lord, I lose money some days because I would rather feed a hungry man than turn him off my corner. You have got me written down on your fine cardstock as an informal vendor arrangement. She let those 3 words hang in the cinderblock air. I'm not here about me. I want to talk to you about Marcus Ridley. That man's father filled my mother's prescriptions back when no bank in this state would loan that family the fare to get downtown to be told no in person. Miss Annie Caldwell is sitting right there in the front, 86 years old, and the day you close that pharmacy is the day she cannot walk to her own heart medicine. You go on and put that in your slideshow. Her voice did not rise. It got, if anything, lower, and the whole room leaned down into it. We are not a corridor. We are not an asset that has got to perform for somebody. We are people who have been taking care of each other on that one corner since before your firm had a name on a door. And I am asking the man who owns these buildings, wherever he is, whoever he is, however much money he's got, I am asking him to come down here to this basement and look us in our faces before he sells our corner out from under us in the dark. Because a deed is just a piece of paper, and I have lived 61 years, and a piece of paper has never one time kept a single soul on God's earth warm. She sat down. Marcus Ridley had his hand pressed flat over his mouth, because Marcus Ridley knew exactly who owned these buildings, and Marcus Ridley knew that the man was sitting 4 feet to his left on a folding chair by the door. In the back of the room, by the door, under the water pipes, an old man in a gray field coat stood up. The room did not know him. Jordan Calverton, who had taken his every instruction from a holding company and a lawyer in 3 words, had never in his life laid eyes on the principal and did not know him. But Marcus Ridley stood up too, fast, on pure reflex, the way you get to your feet when an elder you respect rises, and that one young pharmacist standing up out of his folding chair made the whole room turn around to see. Ezra Holloway walked up the center aisle of the basement of Sharon Baptist Church, past the rows of folding chairs, past Vernon, past Deacon Pruitt, past Miss Annie Caldwell with both hands on her cane, and he stopped beside the card table where Jordan Calverton stood with the slideshow still glowing 41% on the wall behind him, and he turned around, an old man in an old coat, 81 years old, and he faced the room he had been sitting in front of for 3 years. My name is Ezra Holloway, he said. The room was dead silent. I came up out of Bamberg County, South Carolina, in the fall of 1961 with another man's address folded down in my shoe. I swept floors for $1.15 an hour. I learned to lay brick from a man named Stanley Kowalski. A few people laughed, soft and startled, and let it go. And I own these buildings. The room made a sound, low, a single sound made by 60 throats doing the same arithmetic at once. I own the pharmacy. I own the barber shop. I own the empty store and the 4 boarded houses down the 1100 block and 3 more streets you don't know about. I own the corner this lady has sold her plates on for 22 years. He turned his head, slow, the way an old neck turns, until he was looking at Loretta Pinkney, who had gone perfectly still in her folding chair, the envelope crushed in her fist, her mind not yet able to lay the gray coat over the bench, over the foil plate, over the impossible word. Own. And I own the bench, Ezra said, soft now, just to her, the whole room straining forward to hear it, where this woman has set a plate of hot food in my lap every working day for 3 years, and never one time asked me my name. Loretta Pinkney rose up out of her folding chair very slowly. She stood for some number of seconds that nobody in that basement counted, looking at the old man in the gray coat, and the corner came back together in her mind one piece at a time. The bench, the plate, the cornbread he always ate first, the okra she'd quietly stopped giving him, the day she'd asked, "You got someplace to go?" and he'd said, "No, ma'am, I don't believe I do." Tea, and she had told him, with her whole chest, "Then I'll find you one." And the whole time, the whole entire 3 years, this man could have bought and sold the very ground she was standing on and not noticed the dollar leave his hand. And the first thing she felt was not wonder. It was shame, pure and hot, up the back of her neck and into her ears, the particular shame of a proud woman who believes she has been feeding a beggar out of her own thin pocket and learns she has, all along, been feeding a king. "You let me," she started, and her voice was not low and gentle now. 3 years. 3 years I gave you off my own table thinking you didn't have a... She stopped herself. She put her hand to her mouth. The room held its breath for her. "You gave it to me the same as you'd give it to anybody," Ezra said. "A man with nothing or a man with everything, same plate, same cornbread, same hand. That, ma'am, that is the entire reason I let you do it." He came down off the riser and walked toward her, and the rows of chairs let him pass, and he stopped in front of her, an old man who could have phoned her every loss away 100 times over, and had chosen instead to sit on a cold bench and eat her bread in silence. "I have got more money than I am able to count," and I have had it for 30 years. And in 3 years on that corner, you are the only living soul who ever offered me one single thing without first taking the trouble to find out what I was worth." His chin moved, just barely. "My wife used to feed this whole block out of our own kitchen on Garrison, Della. She died 4 years ago, 11 weeks from the doctor's word to the grave, and I told myself the way to never hurt like that again was to love a building. On account of a building can't leave you in the night." He shook his head, slow. "And I sat on that bench 3 years proving myself right. And every bled day you walked over and proved me a fool, and you never once knew you were doing it." Marcus Ridley was crying without an ounce of shame in the second row. Miss Annie Caldwell had both her hands gripping the head of her cane. "I signed a paper I did not read," Ezra said, turning back to the room now, and his voice carried an old voice, but a builder's voice, a voice that had told masons what to do for half a century. "Because I let my grief make me a stupid old man. There is no repositioning initiative." He looked straight at Jordan Calverton, who had gone the gray of his own cinderblock wall. "Mr. Calverton, you and your firm are released as of tonight, the 17th. The pharmacy stays. Marcus, your lease renews. At the same rent you're paying now, not $1 more, for as long as you want the corner. Your daddy filled my Della's prescriptions for 40 years and rounded her insulin down every single time and never once told me he was doing it. The wellness flagship can go find some other corner in this city to wellness all over." A sound went through the room that was not quite a cheer, because the people in that room had learned long ago not to cheer until the man with the paper had actually left the building. But it was close. Then Ezra Holloway turned, slow, all the way back around to Loretta Pinkney, and the basement of Sharon Baptist held its breath, and he said the thing that finally brought the wall the rest of the way down. For the first time in 50 years, the old man said, "I would like to sit down and eat a meal at a table with another living person. Not on a bench. At a table with a chair, like a man. And if there is a woman in this room who knows how to set one more plate than she has got mouths to feed, I would be deeply obliged to her." And Loretta Pinkney, who had not wept in that church basement since the day in 2018 they carried Curtis out of it in a box, put her 2 hands over her face and wept. It would be a lie to tell you it was simple after that. Ezra Holloway tried to give her money first, because writing a check is the thing men who hold deeds know how to do with their feelings. $20,000. He said, just to start, just to get her off that folding table. And Loretta Pinkney turned it down, flatter than he'd been turned down in 40 years, because she was her mother's daughter, and her mother had come up from Allendale County on the back of a Trailways bus with $11.40 and a skillet in a flour sack, and would have walked the whole 300 miles home before she'd have taken charity. She had not stood on her feet and earned. "I don't take what I haven't worked for," Loretta told him in Della's kitchen on Garrison 2 weeks later, at the formica table where Della's chair still faced his and where Loretta now sat, having cooked the man a Sunday dinner he ate slow, with his eyes closed half the time, the way you eat when the food is doing more than feeding you. "I have not taken one dime off that corner in 22 years that I didn't stand 9 hours on my feet to earn. I am not about to start at 61 years old in a dead woman's kitchen, no disrespect to her." "None taken," Ezra said. "She'd have liked you." He set his fork down. He'd been turning this over for 2 weeks the way he used to turn over a tricky course of brick before he laid it. "I'm not offering you a handout, Loretta. I'm offering you a building." He laid it out plain, the way Stanley Kowalski had taught him to lay everything plain. The empty storefront right next to Ridley Drug, 1107 North Carey, the one boarded gray for 19 years, the one he had owned for 50 and never once been able to make himself rent out, because Della was the one who'd handled the renting, and after Della there was no one to hand a key to. He wanted Loretta to take it. Not as a gift, as a tenant with a real lease, signed at a rent of $1 a year, which made her sputter and start to stand up from the table, until he explained it the way Della would have explained it to him. $1 a year is not charity," he said. $1 a year is a man finally doing with one of his 41 buildings the exact thing his wife spent 46 years telling him a building is for. "You'd be doing me the favor, Loretta. You'd be letting an old fool one thing right." He looked at her across the formica. "You'll run it. You're over the door, your prices, and don't you dare raise them on my account. I know you've been wanting to, and I'll know if you do. Your mother's skillet on a real range with 2 good burners and a vent hood that works. You'll put in a counter and some stools, so a man's Habane's place to sit and eat besides a bench in February. And the plates that don't sell, the ones you've been carrying across a sidewalk to strangers for 3 years off a folding table, you keep right on giving them away. Except now there's a roof over it, and heat, and you will never again in your life be $41 short on your taxes in July, because you'll be drawing a real wage out of a real business with your real name on the deed of the lease." He picked his fork back up. That is not a handout, that is me hiring the best landlord I never once had the good sense to be. Loretta took the lease, but she made him write into it in his own hand that she would repay the cost of the build-out. Every dollar of the $31,000 it ran to put in the range and the hood and the counter and the 8 stools and to bring the wiring up to code. At $50 a month, every month, starting the first until it was square. And Ezra signed it that way because he understood, finally, that her pride was not a thing standing in the way of the gift. Her pride was the gift. It was the exact same muscle that had made her carry a hot plate to a stranger's bench for 3 years and never ask his name. And you do not get to keep the kindness and amputate the pride. They come off the same bone. They opened on the 4th of October. Pinkney's, the new sign read, hand-painted by the same man, Reggie, who'd done the folding table sign back in 2003, except over a real door under a real awning. 8 stools, 4 tables, a counter 12 feet long. The skillet came off the home stove, where it had sat for 66 years and went onto a 6-burner Vulcan range that used off a closed diner in Dundalk for $2,200 and had hauled in himself, supervising 2 young men he paid cash and fed twice. 66 years old, that skillet, and still blacker and slicker than anything that came out of the box. The greens cooked down slow with the turkey neck. The cornbread came out of the oven in 22 minutes at 425 in squares. And the first person to sit down at the new counter, on the first morning, on the very first stool, the one nearest the door, the one that after that day nobody else ever sat in, was an old man in a gray field coat. Loretta set down in front of him a plate of smothered chicken with the cornbread square balanced on top. And when she set it down, the old man reached up and caught her wrist, gentle, the way you hold a thing you have finally learned you are allowed to keep. You sit down too, Ezra said. You've been standing 9 hours a day since you were 9 years old. Sit down, eat one with me, that's the only rent I'm collecting. And Marcus Ridley, who'd come in from next door on his 15-minute break, picked a plate up off the warming tray with his own hands, slid it down the new 12-foot counter to where Loretta stood, and pulled out the stool beside the old man. And for the first time in 7 years, maybe, when she thought about it later that night, for the first time in her whole life, somebody set Loretta Pinkney's plate down in front of Loretta Pinkney. She sat, she ate, and for once, just once, she did not watch anybody else eat first. The corner did not turn into a miracle. It turned into a kitchen, which is a great deal better and lasts a great deal longer. By the following spring, Pinkney's was the busiest counter in 9 blocks. They were doing 110, 120 plates a day, more on the first of the month when the checks came. Loretta hired Vernon's niece, Keisha, 23, who'd been laid off from a call center, to work the counter at $16 an hour, and a dishwasher, a quiet young man named Tariq, 18, who came in at noon after his GED class. The plates stayed 16. Loretta did, finally, after much grumbling from everyone, allow herself to add a Friday fish fry at $8, and it sold out by 1 o'clock every single week, and the line for it went out the door and down past the pharmacy. Marcus Ridley's pharmacy stayed exactly where it had stood for 53 years. Same corner, same marble composition book for the tabs, same rounded-down insulin. Miss Annie Caldwell still walked there with her aluminum cane, and now there was a stool waiting for her to rest on at Pinkney's halfway, and a cup of coffee already poured by the time she got to it. And on the bad knee days, Tariq walked her the last block with her arm through his. Vernon the barber stayed. Deacon Pruitt took his lunch at the counter every Wednesday after he visited the sick. The 4 boarded houses down the 1100 block, the ones Calverton was going to reposition into something nobody on the street could afford. Ezra leased them out instead, the way Della would have, cheap, to families from the neighborhood on handshakes that he backed up this time with real paper, because he had learned expensively what happens when an old man stops reading his own paper. And he set up a thing too, because Loretta would not stop giving plates away to whoever sat down quiet and couldn't pay, and Ezra Holloway finally quit pretending she ought to. He went to his lawyer of 41 years and he made a fund. A real one, money set into it so that any morning a person sat down at the Pinkney's counter and turned their pockets out, the plate was already paid for. Quiet, no announcement, no separate line for the ones who couldn't, no different bread, no cheaper greens. He wanted at first to name it after himself, the Ezra Holloway something. The H.D. Holloway Community Meal Initiative, the lawyer wrote up, and Ezra looked at the words on the page a long while. Then he took the pen and crossed it out. He named it the Vernita Fund. After Loretta's mother, the woman who came up from Allendale County in 1959 with a skillet and a flour sack and the only instruction that ever mattered, which was that you set one more plate than you've got mouths, because hungry don't always knock. He had the lawyer put $200,000 into it to start and arrange for it to be fed every year out of the rents on the 1100 block so that the buildings at long last were doing the one thing Della had spent 46 years swearing buildings were for. He didn't tell Loretta until the paperwork was signed and filed at the courthouse. When he finally did, sliding the single page across the counter to her between the lunch rush and the dinner rush, Loretta read it twice, slow, the way she read everything. Then she went out to the back by the range and stood there a while with her hand flat on the warm iron of her mother's skillet, and she came back out front with her face composed, and all she said was, "She'd have liked that." And that was the whole of what either one of them ever said about it, and it was enough. The first year, the Vernita Fund fed 4,100 plates to people who could not pay for them, and nobody in the place could have told you which 4,100, because that was the entire point, and that was how Loretta ran it, and Ezra never asked for a count. There is a boy who runs the corner now. Deshaun, 11 years old, Deacon Pruitt's grandson, whom Loretta pays $4 an hour out of her own apron to wipe down tables and refill the napkin holders, and who eats his lunch at the counter every day on the house. One afternoon that spring a woman came around from city office, a clipboard and a lanyard, doing a write-up on small businesses in the revitalized corridor, taking notes, and she asked, of the room in general, what it was that made the place special. And Deshaun answered before any grown person in the room could get a word out. "Miss Loretta feeds everybody," he said, shrugging, like the woman with the clipboard had asked him something with an obvious answer that any fool could see, even the ones that can't pay. Even before she found out Mr. Ezra had all that money, she fed him anyway for years when she thought he was just some old man. He took another bite of his cornbread, the square off the top first, the way the old man at the end of the counter always ate it. "My granddaddy says she'd have fed him the exact same plate if he was flat broke. My granddaddy says that's the whole reason it counts." The woman wrote it down. Loretta, at the range with her back turned, pretended she hadn't heard a word of it. Ezra, on his stool, the first stool, the one nearest the door, the one nobody else ever sat in, heard every single word and looked down at his plate and ate his cornbread first. He came in 6 days a week, same as he'd sat on the bench 6 days a week, and he ate the cornbread first 300 days a year. But he was not invisible anymore. The whole block knew him now. Mr. Ezra T, the man who saved the corner, though the ones who'd been there that July knew the truer version, which was the man whose corner got saved by a plate of greens. And the strangest thing, the thing he tried exactly once to put into words to Marcus over the locking grate at dusk and could not finish, was that being known had not cost him a single thing. He had spent 50 years believing the only safe thing a man could own was a deed, that to love a body was to set yourself up to be left in the night, and here he was at 82, an old man with no wife and no children, and one kitchen full of people who said his name like it was something warm to hold, and he was less afraid than he had been in his entire life. Not braver, just less afraid. There is a difference, and he had finally lived long enough to find it. Some evenings, after the dinner rush thinned and Keisha had gone home and it was just the two of them, Loretta wiping down the Vulcan with a rag that never came all the way clean, and Ezra nursing the last of his coffee, the old man would say, "Della would have run this place better than the both of us put together." And Loretta would say, "Probably so," and neither one of them would say the rest of it out loud, which was that Della was running it in the only way the dead get to run the places we build to keep them with us. In the recipe out of Vernita's skillet, in the fund in Vernita's name, in the $1 a year lease, that was just Della's voice on the first of the month finally getting the last word. "Ezra, you cannot eat a building, no. But you can open one up and put a counter in it, and let a woman set one more plate than she's got mouths for whoever hungry happens to come in out of the cold and sit and quiet and wait to see if anybody in this whole hard world is going to notice them." Somebody noticed. For 3 years on a cold green bench, in a gray coat, somebody noticed an old man the whole city had agreed to look through. That was the entire thing. That was always from the very first foil plate, the entire thing. If this story puts somebody in your mind, somebody who feeds people without ever being asked, who works the long shift nobody claps for, who sets out the extra plate and would be embarrassed if you called it kindness, then you already know exactly who they are. Send this to them. Don't explain it. Just let them know that somebody, somewhere, saw it. But here is the question I want to leave sitting in the room with you, because I have turned it over for a long time, and I am honestly not sure I have got it right. Loretta fed that man for 3 years not knowing he was worth more than her whole street, and when she found out, the very first thing that rose up in her was not joy. It was shame. The shame of having quietly pitied a man richer than she would be in 10 lifetimes. So this is the thing that splits a room. Did Ezra Holloway owe her the truth? Was his silence a kindness? Letting her give the way only the unknowing can give, clean, with no math in it, Or was it a small, slow theft, an old man with everything taking 3 years of a poor woman's table and her pity and calling it humility? Was the not telling grace, or was it just one more way that a man who has everything finds to take something from a woman who has almost nothing, and feel good about himself while he does it? Tell me where you land on that. I have changed my mind twice writing it and I still don't know. There's a line in tonight's story I keep coming back to. It belongs to Loretta's mother. She says you set one more plate than you've got mouths. Because hungry don't always knock. Sometimes it just sits down quiet and waits to see if you'll notice. I wrote that line and then I just sat there a while. I'm at the age where I'm starting to be the one who sets the table. I count the chairs now. I never used to count chairs. The thing is, the woman in this story fed a man for 3 years and never asked what he was worth. That's the part I can't get past. She didn't need to know, she fed him anyway. I keep thinking about who's hearing this right now. Maybe it's late where you are. Maybe you're the home aide on the last hour of a double. Maybe you packed an extra plate today and felt a little foolish about it. Don't. You weren't foolish. You were her. I'll be back next week with another story about someone the world keeps walking past. I'm still not sure I've earned this line. I think you might have. You set one more plate than you've got mouths. Because hungry don't always knock.